Did Africans discover America before Columbus? Did black people sail to America first? Who really discovered the Americas? Why does Columbus get credit when he wasn't even close to being first? These are the questions millions of people type every single day. And the answer is this: yes. Not maybe. Not possibly. Yes. Africans were sailing to the Americas before Columbus was born, before his grandfather was born, before anyone in Europe had the nerve to call the Atlantic Ocean anything other than the Sea of Darkness they were too afraid to cross. The evidence is in the stone. Literally, 17 colossal stone heads carved by the Olmec civilization in Mexico, some weighing up to 40 tons, with the unmistakable facial features of West African people, sitting in the jungle of Mesoamerica, carved between 900 and 400 BC. The evidence is in the oral history of the Mali Empire, where the 14th century Arabic historian Al-Umari documented the emperor sending 2,000 boats across the Atlantic Ocean in 1311. The evidence is the Botanical record, where African crops appear in pre-Columbian American soil and American crops appear in pre-Columbian African soil, in a pattern that cannot be explained by wind and birds. And the evidence is in Columbus's own journals, where he wrote that the indigenous people of the Caribbean told him that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast, carrying gold-tipped spears and a specific alloy that metallurgical analysis later matched to West African production. Columbus knew Africans had been there before him. He wrote it down, and then history pretended he said nothing. Tonight we are ending that pretense. Did you know Columbus was not even trying to discover new land? He was trying to find a shortcut to Asia. He died believing he had reached Asia. The man the United States built a national holiday around. The man whose name was put on the capital district of the most powerful country on earth did not know where he was, had not gone where he intended, and arrived in a place where African people had already been leaving footprints, planting crops, building trade relationships, and shaping culture for anywhere between 300 and 2,000 years before his 3 small ships limped onto a Caribbean beach in 1492. Columbus Day is not a celebration of discovery. It is a celebration of ignorance that arrived late. And the people who got there first, who built the ships, crossed the ocean, established contact, traded goods, and left their faces carved in stone across a continent, were African. Let's start with the Olmec heads, because these are the most physically overwhelming piece of evidence in the entire argument, and they have been sitting in plain sight in Mexican museums for over 100 years, while the mainstream archaeological establishment did gymnastics to avoid the obvious conclusion staring back at them from the stone. The Olmec civilization is considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the foundational civilization from which the Maya, the Aztec, and every subsequent major Mesoamerican civilization drew their cultural inheritance. The Olmecs flourished in the Gulf Coast lowlands of what is now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco from approximately 1500 BC to 400 BC. They built the first pyramids in the Americas. They developed the first writing system in Mesoamerica. They played the first recorded ball game in human history. They created a calendar system that the Maya later elaborated. They were, without question, the foundational civilization of the entire pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. And they left 17 stone portraits of men whose faces, whose specific anatomical features, whose broad noses, full lips, rounded facial structure, and overall phenotypic profile mapped directly onto West African physiognomy. 17. These are not small objects. The largest of the Olmec heads stands nearly 3.5 meters tall and weighs approximately 40 tons. These are massive, deliberate, expensive monuments. Whoever the Olmec people were depicting in these heads, they thought them important enough to dedicate enormous resources of labor, stone quarrying, transportation, and skilled carving to immortalize their faces at colossal scale. And those faces look African. The mainstream archaeological response to the Olmec heads has been to argue that the faces simply represent a phenotypic type found among indigenous Mesoamerican populations. That certain indigenous people in the region naturally have broad noses and full lips and rounded facial features that happen to look African to a modern observer trained to see race in specific ways. This argument has been made consistently since the heads were first extensively studied in the 20th century. It is not a crazy argument. Physical anthropology is complicated, human facial variation is wide, and the projection of modern racial categories onto ancient archaeological objects is genuinely fraught with interpretive danger. All of that is true, but here is the problem with the mainstream response. It has never satisfactorily explained why the Olmec heads look dramatically different from the facial features of the population surrounding them. The other human figures in Olmec art, the figures on jade carvings and ceramics and smaller sculptures, show a range of facial types, including the slanted eyes, sharp features, and thinner lips associated with indigenous Mesoamerican populations. But the colossal heads are consistently, dramatically, systematically distinct from these other figures. They are portraits of specific individuals, not idealized types, because each one has distinct facial features that differentiate it from the others. They are portraits of real people, and the real people they portray look like they came from West Africa. Ivan van Sertima was a Guyanese-born scholar who taught at Rutgers University, and his 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, is the foundational academic work making the case for pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas. Van Sertima was not a Hotep blogger. He was a university professor of comparative literature and African studies, who was also a fellow of the prestigious Journal of African Civilizations, and who presented his research to the Smithsonian Institution. His book draws on linguistics, botany, archaeology, art history, oceanography, and historical documentary analysis to build a multi-layered case that African peoples made contact with the Americas centuries before Columbus. The book has been criticized by mainstream academic archaeologists. Some of those criticisms are valid, and Van Sertima engaged seriously with his critics throughout his career. But the argument has never been simply dismissed by serious scholars. It has been taken seriously enough to be debated at the highest levels of academic discourse. And in the decades since his publication, several lines of evidence he identified have been strengthened by subsequent research, while the mainstream narrative of pre-Columbian isolation of the Americas has been repeatedly challenged by findings that the field has been slow to fully integrate. Why did the Mali Empire send 2,000 boats into the Atlantic Ocean in 1311? This is the question that most people have never been asked, because most people have never heard that it happened, because the event, documented by a credible medieval Arab historian and a widely studied Arabic source, has been systematically ignored in the Western history curriculum. Here is what the sources say. The Arabic historian Shihab al-Umari, writing in the 14th century based on first-hand accounts gathered from Egyptian scholars who had spoken with Mali Emperor Mansa Musa during his famous 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, records a story that Mansa Musa told about his predecessor. Mansa Musa's predecessor as Emperor of Mali was a man named Abu Bakr II. According to what Mansa Musa told his Egyptian interlocutors, Abu Bakr II was seized with a passionate curiosity about what lay on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. He organized a fleet of 2,000 boats, filled them with provisions for a long voyage, and set sail westward into the Atlantic. Only one boat came back. The captain of that surviving boat told Abu Bakr II that a powerful river current in the middle of the ocean had swallowed the other boats. Abu Bakr II then organized a second expedition, this time of 1,000 boats, and personally led it. He sailed west and was never seen again. Mansa Musa told this story to explain how he had become emperor. Abu Bakr II had abdicated the throne of the wealthiest empire on earth, an empire producing half the world's gold supply, to sail west into an unknown ocean. That is not the behavior of a man launching a casual fishing trip. That is an emperor with maritime intelligence about something worth finding. The date is critical. Abu Bakr II sailed in 1311. Columbus sailed in 1492. The Mali fleet preceded Columbus by 181 years. And the Mali Empire at the time of Abu Bakr II's expedition was at the peak of its power and sophistication. Timbuktu was already one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The Malian gold trade had been operating for centuries. The empire had diplomatic relationships with North African and Arab powers and access to a centuries-long tradition of trans-Saharan and maritime knowledge. The navigational knowledge available to Malian scholars through the libraries of Timbuktu included Arabic geographic and astronomical texts that described ocean currents, wind patterns, and the potential for westward navigation. The question is not whether the Mali Empire had the intellectual resources to conceive of a transatlantic expedition. It clearly did. The question is whether 2,000 boats and an emperor disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean, and whether any of them reached the other side. The answer to the first part of the question is yes, because al-Umari's account is a credible historical source. The answer to the second part is the mystery that the physical evidence is slowly beginning to resolve. What ocean currents existed that could have carried African boats to the Americas? And did Africans know about them? The oceanography of this question is fascinating and is the dimension of the evidence that is hardest to dismiss with any intellectual honesty. The North Equatorial Current is a major surface current that flows westward across the Atlantic Ocean from the coast of West Africa toward the Caribbean. It runs at speeds of between 1 and 3 knots and follows a path that, if a boat were placed in it and simply allowed to drift, would carry that boat from the West African coast to the Caribbean in weeks to months, depending on the starting point and the specific current behavior. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer and anthropologist, demonstrated in 1969 with his Ra 1 and Ra 2 expeditions that a papyrus reed boat of ancient Egyptian design could successfully cross the Atlantic Ocean using these currents. He built the boats using traditional methods, launched from the Moroccan coast, and made the crossing with the Ra 2 in 7 days in 1970, arriving in Barbados. The construction technique was consulted and partly executed by Baduma people from Lake Chad in Africa, who had maintained the tradition of building papyrus reed boats into the modern era. Heyerdahl's expedition did not prove that ancient Africans crossed the Atlantic, but it proved conclusively that the technology to do so, reed boats of traditional African design, was adequate for the voyage, and that the ocean currents would cooperate. The mechanism was viable. The current existed. The boats existed. The maritime tradition existed. West African maritime culture in the pre-Columbian era was far more sophisticated than the standard curriculum acknowledges. The peoples of the West African coast, particularly the populations living along what is now Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and the surrounding region, have maintained sophisticated maritime traditions for centuries before the 14th century. The Sierra people of what is now Senegal and Gambia had a maritime tradition going back thousands of years and were among the most skilled boat builders and navigators on the West African coast. The Lebu people of Dakar were deep-sea fishermen with an intimate knowledge of Atlantic Ocean currents. Oral traditions among several West African coastal peoples include accounts of great ocean voyages to lands in the West, lands with specific characteristics that bear interesting resemblances to to descriptions of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. These oral traditions have been documented by researchers including Gaucho Diawara, a Malian historian who has spent decades tracing the indigenous accounts of pre-Columbian African voyages in the oral historical traditions of West African communities. The traditions are consistent across communities that had no contact with each other, describing voyages to lands in the West, where the ocean turns to fresh water at the mouths of great rivers, where there are mountains of gold, where the people they encountered were generous and the lands were abundant. The freshwater description is particularly interesting because the Amazon River pours such an enormous volume of fresh water into the Atlantic that a boat approaching the mouth of the Amazon from the east would encounter fresh water in the ocean far from shore, a distinctive and memorable phenomenon that would have been immediately notable to ocean-going sailors. What is the botanical evidence for pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas, and why has it been taken seriously by botanists and scientists who have not been willing to commit to the full argument? Plants are the most neutral witnesses in historical detective work because plants do not have political agendas, do not respond to academic pressure, and do not make arguments. They simply grow where they have been planted or where their seeds have been carried. The botanical evidence for transatlantic contact before Columbus is substantial and has been building for decades. Cotton is the most discussed example. The cotton plant native to Africa, Gossypium herbaceum, and the cotton plant found in pre-Columbian America, Gossypium hirsutum, are different species. But early genetic analysis of the American cotton species revealed that it appeared to contain genetic material from the Old World cotton species that had no explanation through natural seed dispersal across the Atlantic Ocean. The simplest explanation for this anomaly is that humans carried Old World cotton to the Americas, and it hybridized with the American species. This has been a subject of ongoing botanical and genetic debate, and the conclusions remain contested. But the question has been raised and taken seriously by mainstream plant scientists, not just by Afrocentric scholars. The sweet potato is another compelling case. The sweet potato is indigenous to South America, but was being cultivated in Polynesia before European contact, which is accepted as evidence of pre-Columbian trans-Pacific contact between South Americans and Polynesians. If plants could travel across the Pacific through human contact before Columbus, the argument that plants could not travel across the Atlantic through human contact requires a specific explanation for why one ocean was a human highway and the other was an impenetrable barrier. Bottle gourds provide perhaps the most specific and technically robust botanical argument. Bottle gourds, Lagenaria ciceraria, are African in origin, have seeds that cannot survive long-duration ocean drift because the salt water kills the germination capacity of the seeds before the ocean currents could carry the gourd from Africa to the Americas. And yet pre-Columbian American populations had bottle gourds and were using them as containers before Europeans arrived. The only explanation for this that does not invoke pre-Columbian human contact is awkward genetic special pleading about exceptional seed viability. And that explanation has not satisfied the botanists who have studied the problem. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2005 used molecular analysis of bottle gourd specimens and concluded that the American bottle gourds most likely arrived in the Americas through human transport from Africa, not through natural ocean dispersal. This is mainstream science published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, concluding that humans transported an African plant to the Americas in the pre-Columbian period. That finding is not a fringe claim. It is peer-reviewed science with implications that the academic establishment has been slow to fully follow to their logical conclusion. What did Columbus actually write in his journals about evidence of prior African contact, and why is this not in any textbook? Christopher Columbus maintained detailed journals of his voyages, and while the original journals are lost, A version survives through a transcription made by the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a contemporary of Columbus and had access to the originals. In his account of his third voyage in 1498, Columbus describes a specific piece of evidence that he took as confirmation that African contact with the Americas had preceded him. He writes that the indigenous people of the region he was then exploring, in the vicinity of what is now Venezuela and Trinidad, had told him through interpreters that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast, carrying spears tipped with a metal they called guanine. Columbus collected samples of this guanine metal and sent them back to Spain for analysis. The analysis, according to the account of Las Casas, found that the composition of the guanine alloy was consistent with West African gold production methods, specifically a gold-copper-silver alloy in proportions that matched the typical composition of gold objects produced in Guinea. This is not myth. This is not speculation. This is Columbus, the man the history books credit with discovering America, writing in his own journal that the indigenous people told him black people had been there before him, and sending physical evidence of that prior African presence back to Spain for laboratory analysis. The evidence was in the journals. It was in the metallurgical analysis, and it disappeared from the historical narrative as thoroughly as the African people whose prior presence it documented. What role did the Mandinka people play in documented pre-Columbian transatlantic contact? And what does the historical evidence actually show? The Mandinka, one of the major ethnic groups of the Mali Empire, were skilled mariners whose fishing and trading traditions extended into the open Atlantic along the West African coast. Their boats, large dugout canoes, and reed vessels capable of ocean navigation were documented by Portuguese explorers who encountered them on the West African coast in the 15th century. The Portuguese, who were themselves conducting systematic exploration of the African coast in the decades before Columbus's 1492 voyage, left written accounts of West African maritime culture that confirmed the existence of sophisticated boat-building traditions and deep water navigation capabilities among the peoples of the Senegambian coast. A Portuguese explorer named Diogo Gomes, writing in the 1450s, described encountering Mandinka fishermen far out in the Atlantic Ocean, well beyond the sight of land, fishing with techniques that imply both deep water experience and navigational competence. If Mandinka fishermen were operating far out into the Atlantic in the 1450s, 40 years before Columbus, the question of whether those same fishermen or their predecessors could have extended their range across the full Atlantic with the assistance of the prevailing currents is not a question that can be answered with a simple no on the basis that the distance seems too great. The distance from the West African coast to the Caribbean, following the North Equatorial Current, is approximately 4,500 kilometers. That is a long ocean voyage. But it is not a conceptually different order of magnitude from the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean voyages that ancient and medieval maritime cultures were routinely making. Does the genetic evidence support pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas? And what has modern DNA research found? The genetic evidence is the dimension of this argument that is most rapidly developing and most consequential for the final verdict on whether Africans reached the Americas before Columbus. Ancient DNA technology has advanced dramatically in the last 2 decades, and researchers are now able to extract and sequence genetic material from pre-Columbian indigenous American remains with enough precision to detect specific population admixture events and their approximate dates. A 2021 study published in Nature used ancient genome data from indigenous populations across North and South America and found evidence of population connectivity and admixture events that the researchers described as complex and not fully explained by the standard model of 2 or 3. Migration waves into the Americas from Northeast Asia across the Bahrain land bridge. While the Nature study was not specifically about African contact, and did not claim to have identified African genetic signatures. It demonstrated that the genetic history of pre-Columbian American populations is more complex than the standard brain straight model predicts. Separately, a study of the genome of the Botanical people of Brazil, published in 2013, found the presence of Polynesian genetic signatures in 2 pre-Columbian Brazilian individuals. An unexpected finding that demonstrated clearly that transoceanic genetic contact happened between the Americas and the Pacific before Columbus arrived. If trans-Pacific contact was occurring, the question of transatlantic contact cannot be resolved simply by asserting it was impossible. The ocean was permeable. People were crossing it. The debate is about who and when and from which direction, not about whether it was possible. What were the Olmec pyramids, and why is their architectural similarity to African structures significant? The Olmec people built massive earthen pyramid mounds, the largest of which, La Venta Pyramid in Tabasco, Mexico, stands approximately 30 meters tall and is one of the largest pre-Columbian structures in the Americas. These pyramid structures, predating the later and more famous Maya and Aztec pyramids, have been compared structurally to pyramid forms found in West Africa, particularly the earthen step platform mounds found in the ancient cities of the Saharan and Sahelian region. The comparison is not identical, and mainstream archaeologists have been quick to point out that pyramidal structures appear independently in many cultures as a natural solution to the engineering problem of building tall monuments with primitive technology. This is a valid point. Pyramids are not uniquely African, and their appearance in Mesoamerica does not by itself constitute evidence of African contact. But the pyramids are not the only architectural parallel. The ball court, the ritual playing field associated with the Mesoamerican ball game that the Olmec invented and that spread through every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization, had structural similarities to ritual ball game traditions documented in West Africa. The ritual significance of the game, which involved elements of sacrifice, divination, and cosmological enactment, also has parallels in West African ceremonial traditions that have been noted by scholars including Van Sertima. When multiple cultural parallels appear together in the same time and place, the argument that each one is independently invented becomes cumulatively less convincing than the argument that a common source connects them. How does the Quetzalcoatl mythology connect to possible African or non-indigenous contact with ancient Mesoamerica? And what do the sources actually say? Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent deity of Mesoamerican religion, one of the most important figures in the entire pre-Columbian religious pantheon. Worshipped by the Olmec, the Teotihuacan culture, the Toltec, and the Aztec across nearly 2,000 years of Mesoamerican religious history. The specific traditions associated with Quetzalcoatl describe him as a man, a historical figure, not just a deity, who arrived from across the sea, who taught the people arts, sciences, and civilized practices, and who eventually departed back across the sea, promising to return. The description in Aztec sources of Quetzalcoatl includes references to dark skin in some traditions, which is one of the details that Van Sertima and others have pointed to as potentially reflecting the memory of an African visitor. The darker interpretation of the Quetzalcoatl tradition has also been used to explain why Moctezuma initially welcomed Hearne Courts in 1519, believing that the returning Quetzalcoatl had arrived as prophesied. This later interpretation, the Quetzalcoatl Courts identification, has been extensively debated by historians and is now considered by most scholars to be a post-conquest rationalization constructed by indigenous informants under Spanish influence rather than a genuine pre-conquest belief. But the core mythology of a teacher figure arriving from across the sea remains, and its origin is genuinely mysterious. It does not require an African explanation. But the African explanation fits certain elements of the tradition in ways that the standard indigenous origin explanation does not fully resolve. What is the linguistic evidence for pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas? And how has it been evaluated by scholars? Van Sertima in They Came Before Columbus includes a chapter on linguistic parallels between West African languages and pre-Columbian indigenous American languages, arguing that certain words, place names, and linguistic structures found in Mesoamerican cultures have counterparts in Mande and other West African language families. This is the most contested dimension of his argument, and mainstream linguists have been the most skeptical critics of this specific evidence strand. Historical linguistics is an extraordinarily precise discipline, and the criteria for establishing genuine linguistic relationship rather than coincidental similarity are stringent. Words can sound alike across languages without being related, a phenomenon linguists call chance resemblance, and identifying true cognates, words related by common ancestry or direct borrowing, requires systematic correspondence patterns rather than individual word similarities. Van Sertima's critics have argued that his linguistic evidence does not meet these standards. These criticisms carry weight and should be taken seriously. The linguistic evidence for pre-Columbian African contact is the weakest part of the overall argument. But the linguistic evidence is also not the only evidence, or even the primary evidence. The botanical, oceanographic, art historical, documentary, and genetic evidence strands are independent of the linguistic argument and stand or fall on their own merits. The weakness of the linguistic evidence does not retroactively invalidate the botanical evidence. Each strand needs to be evaluated on its own terms, and the overall weight of the evidence considered as a whole. Why has the mainstream academic establishment been reluctant to accept the evidence for pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas, and is that reluctance intellectually defensible? The reluctance has multiple dimensions, some of which are scientifically defensible and some of which are not. The defensible scientific concerns are real. The standard of evidence required to overturn a consensus should be high. The comparison of cultural features across oceans is methodologically treacherous. And some of the evidence put forward by African contact theorists has not met rigorous scholarly standards. These concerns are legitimate, and honest engagement with them is required by intellectual integrity. But there are also dimensions of the reluctance that are not scientifically defensible, and that reflect the same ideological pressures that have shaped the treatment of African intellectual and cultural achievement across every field we have examined in this series. The academic establishment's resistance to pre-Columbian African contact research has included a degree of a priori dismissal that is inconsistent with how similar evidence for pre-Columbian trans-Pacific contact has been treated. The evidence for pre-Columbian Polynesian contact with South America, the sweet potato evidence, the chicken bone evidence, the genetic evidence, the Polynesian place names found in indigenous South American languages has been progressively accepted by mainstream archaeology over the past 2 decades. The criteria applied to that evidence by the mainstream have been somewhat less stringent than the criteria applied to evidence for African contact. The asymmetry is difficult to explain purely on scientific grounds. When equivalent evidence for Pacific contact is accepted and equivalent evidence for Atlantic contact is rejected, the difference in treatment requires an explanation. And the most honest explanation involves the same dynamics that have shaped the treatment of African history across every field we have examined. What happened to the people who may have arrived from Africa in the Americas before Columbus, and where did they go? This is the question that the physical evidence raises most acutely, and it does not have a definitive answer. The possibilities range across a spectrum. At one end, African voyagers arrived, made contact, traded, left artifacts including the genetic signature of their crops and possibly the facial template of the Olmec heads, and then returned or died without establishing lasting settlements. This would explain the evidence without requiring large-scale African populations in pre-Columbian America. At the other end, some of the African arrivals integrated into indigenous communities through intermarriage and cultural exchange, contributing to the genetic and cultural diversity of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican populations without creating a separately identifiable African community that would be visible to later observers. The Olmec civilization itself disappeared, absorbed into successor cultures, and the people who carved those colossal heads became the ancestors of the later Mesoamerican populations. If some of those ancestors had African origins, their African ancestry would be diluted and distributed across the populations that followed, not concentrated in a discrete recognizable community. The genetic search for African ancestry in pre-Columbian indigenous populations is ongoing and has not yet produced a definitive confirmed finding. But the methods available to researchers are improving rapidly, and the question remains open. What role did the Phoenicians and Egyptians play in transatlantic contact, and how does the West African argument relate to earlier theories about Mediterranean contact? Before Vansertima's focus on West African contact, a number of scholars and independent researchers had argued for pre-Columbian transatlantic contact by Mediterranean peoples, including the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and the Romans. Evidence cited for these theories included Roman amphorae found on the Brazilian seabed, dated to approximately 100 BC. The Roman amphorae were found in the wreck site at Guanabara Bay in Brazil and were authenticated by marine archaeologists. They were Roman. They were in Brazil. The Brazilian government initially commissioned research on the find and then suppressed the results for reasons that were never fully explained. Reportedly under pressure from archaeologists who believed the finding would complicate the established narrative of pre-Columbian isolation. The amphorae subsequently disappeared from the public record, with their implications unresolved. The Egyptian connection is supported by the presence of cocaine and tobacco in Egyptian mummies, substances whose plant sources, the coca plant and the tobacco plant, were indigenous to South America and not found in the Old World before Columbus's voyages. The presence of cocaine, metabolites, and tobacco in the hair and tissue of Egyptian mummies, confirmed by laboratory analysis, including work by the German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 1992, is a finding whose only straightforward explanation is transatlantic contact between the Americas and Egypt before Columbus. Balabanova's finding was subjected to sustained criticism by mainstream Egyptologists who preferred to argue contamination or error over accepting the implications of the data. Subsequent retesting of different mummies by different laboratories confirmed the original finding. Cocaine and tobacco were in Egyptian mummies. Cocaine and tobacco came from South America. The implication is uncomfortable, and so it has been managed rather than integrated. How does the Columbus narrative itself rest on a foundation of lies? And what did Columbus actually know before he sailed? The standard school curriculum version of Columbus presents him as a bold visionary who dared to sail west into an unknown ocean against the consensus of his contemporaries who believed the earth was flat. This is almost entirely false, and has been known to be false by historians for decades. The educated Europeans of Columbus's era did not believe the earth was flat. That myth was invented in the 19th century. What the educated Europeans of Columbus's era disputed was Columbus's estimate of the earth's circumference, and therefore the distance to Asia sailing westward. Columbus estimated the earth was much smaller than it actually is, which meant he calculated the westward voyage to Asia would be short enough to be survivable. His critics, including the Spanish Royal Commission that initially rejected his proposal, correctly calculated that the earth was too large for the westward voyage to Asia to be feasible with the provisions Columbus was proposing to carry. Columbus was wrong. His critics were right, Columbus only survived his voyage because there happened to be an unknown continent in the way. But why did he think the voyage was shorter than it was? One compelling answer is that he had prior information. Portuguese and Basque fishermen are documented to have been fishing in the waters of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland before Columbus sailed. Columbus himself had made a voyage to the West African coast of Guinea before his 1492 expedition, where he would have encountered Africans who had knowledge of lands to the west. Columbus may have been following intelligence he gathered from multiple sources rather than sailing blindly into the unknown. The heroic Columbus sailing into total darkness is a legend. The historical Columbus was working with a mosaic of information and prior knowledge that the standard narrative has never fully examined. What did the indigenous peoples of the Americas themselves say about who had visited them before Columbus? And why have these accounts been systematically dismissed? Indigenous oral traditions across the Americas include accounts of visitors from the east and from the south who arrived before the Europeans. Some of these accounts describe dark-skinned visitors. The Aztec accounts that relate to Quetzalcoatl we have already discussed. The accounts that relate to the tall, dark-skinned, bearded visitors who arrived in large boats and whose appearance was remembered by coastal indigenous communities in the Caribbean and in South America have been documented by anthropologists and historians, but have generally been categorized as myth or legend rather than historical memory. The systematic dismissal of indigenous oral tradition as historical evidence is one of the most persistent methodological biases in Western academic historiography. We have established in previous videos in this series that oral tradition is a reliable mechanism for historical transmission, capable of preserving accurate information across centuries and even millennia. The oral traditions of West African griots preserve historical information across 7 centuries with documented accuracy. The oral traditions of indigenous Australian peoples preserve accurate information about sea level changes that occurred over 10,000 years ago, confirmed by geological evidence. Indigenous American oral traditions deserve the same presumption of historical validity that oral traditions have earned when they have been studied carefully rather than dismissed reflexively. When indigenous communities across the Caribbean and coastal South America describe dark-skinned visitors who arrived from the east before the Europeans, those accounts are historical evidence. Calling them legend without serious investigation is not archaeology. It is ideology. What was happening in West Africa at the exact time that the Olmec colossal heads were being carved? And does the timing of African maritime activity match the timeline of the Olmec evidence? The Olmec colossal heads date to approximately 1200 BC to 400 BC, with most scholars placing their production in the middle of that range, around 900 to 600 BC. This coincides with the peak of several West African cultures whose maritime capabilities have not been fully studied. The Nok culture of what is now Nigeria, one of the most sophisticated ancient African cultures south of the Sahara, was active from approximately 1500 BC to 200 AD, a period that encompasses the entire Olmec head carving tradition. The Nok are famous for their terracotta sculptures, which show a level of artistic sophistication in representing the human face that is extraordinary for the period. Nok terracotta heads have been compared to the Olmec colossal heads in terms of their artistic conventions for representing the human face, including the treatment of eyes, the depiction of lips, and the overall compositional approach to portraiture. The comparison is not scientific proof, but it is suggestive of a shared or connected artistic tradition that operated across the two regions during the same historical period. The specific centuries in which West African artistic traditions show the most developed treatment of large-scale facial portraiture are also the specific centuries in which the Olmec colossal heads were being carved in Mesoamerica. The geographical distance is vast. The temporal overlap is precise. The artistic parallels are real. The explanation that best fits all three observations is contact. What is the most honest summary of where the evidence currently stands, and what would it take to definitively confirm or refute the pre-Columbian African contact thesis? The most honest summary is this. The evidence for pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas is real, multi-stranded, drawn from independent disciplines, and sufficient to make the question a serious scholarly question rather than a fringe fantasy. It is not yet sufficient to constitute definitive proof that would satisfy the most stringent standards of historical and archaeological evidence. The Olmec heads are the most striking visual evidence and the hardest to explain away, but they are also the most difficult to connect definitively to Africa without physical artifacts of African origin found in Olmec archaeological contexts. The documentary evidence of Abu Bakr II's expedition is credible, and its source is reliable, but it does not document arrival in the Americas, only departure from West Africa. The botanical evidence is the most scientifically compelling because it is drawn from physical materials that can be tested, dated, and analyzed by methods independent of historical interpretation. And the bottle gourd findings published in mainstream peer-reviewed science represent the strongest single piece of objective evidence that transatlantic human contact occurred. The genetic evidence is developing rapidly, and within the next decade may produce findings that resolve the question definitively in one direction or the other. Ancient DNA analysis is advancing at an extraordinary pace, and the ability to detect population and mixture events with precision is improving continuously. If African genetic signatures are found in pre-Columbian indigenous American remains at appropriate depths, that would constitute proof. If systematic ancient genome analysis finds no such signatures, that would substantially weaken the contact thesis while not definitively refuting it given the possibility of contact that did not leave a lasting genetic signature. What does it mean culturally and historically that Christopher Columbus has been the dominant narrative of American discovery for 500 years, while this evidence has sat in libraries, museums, botanical collections, and archaeological sites waiting to be fully reckoned with? It means the same thing it has always meant throughout this series. It means that the story of who did what first is never just a historical question. It is always also a political question about whose achievements are remembered, whose contributions are credited, whose civilizations are treated as innovative, and whose are treated as passive recipients of others' innovations. Columbus getting credit for discovering a continent where Africans had already been leaving their faces carved in 40-ton stone monuments for 1,000 years is not an accident of insufficient evidence. It is an accident of insufficient political will to follow the evidence where it leads. The evidence was always there. The Olmec heads were excavated in the 1860s, and their African features were immediately noted by the researchers who first studied them. The Al-Umari account of Abu Bakr II's fleet was available in Arabic libraries for centuries. Columbus's own journal notes about guanine and dark-skinned prior visitors were in the historical record. The botanical anomalies of bottle gourds and cotton and other transatlantic crops have been documented for generations. None of it was hidden. It was present. It was studied. And it was repeatedly explained away, minimized, dismissed, or simply not presented in the mainstream history curriculum with sufficient seriousness to change the story that schoolchildren in America, Europe, and Africa are taught about who discovered the Americas and why it matters. The story of Columbus discovering America was never just a story about a sailor. It was a story about who gets to be a discoverer and who gets to be discovered. It was a story that positioned European civilization as the active agent of history and every other civilization as the passive recipient of European contact. Under that framework, Africans cannot have discovered America because Africans, in the worldview that the Columbus myth was constructed to serve, do not discover things. They are found. They are encountered. They are civilized. they receive the light that others bring. The Columbus myth was not just a historical claim. It was a statement about the hierarchy of civilizations, and the evidence for African pre-Columbian contact with the Americas is not just a historical counterargument. It is a fundamental challenge to that hierarchy. It says that the people who were told they had no history of exploration, no tradition of navigation, no capacity for discovery, had in fact crossed the largest ocean on Earth and left their faces in stone on another continent before the civilization claiming credit for everything had learned to sail beyond the sight of land. That challenge is why the evidence has been managed rather than followed. That is why the journals of Columbus that mention African prior presence have not become standard curriculum. That is why the bottle-gourd findings published in a prestigious American scientific journal have not been incorporated into the story that American schools tell about how the Americas were populated and contacted. The evidence is not threatening because it is weak. The evidence is threatening because it is strong enough to require a different story. And a different story about who discovers things requires a different story about who matters. What is the legacy of the African presence in the Americas for the people of the African diaspora living in the Western Hemisphere today? The transatlantic slave trade forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, and their descendants constitute a significant portion of the population of the United States, the Caribbean, Brazil, and the rest of Latin America. For those descendants, the question of whether their ancestors were in the Americas before the slave ships is not an abstract historical debate. It is a question about the deepest nature of their relationship to the land they live on. If African people were present in the Americas before Columbus, before the slave trade, before European contact, then the African-descended people living in the Americas today are not only the descendants of enslaved people brought against their will, they are also potentially the descendants of explorers, navigators, traders, and cultural ambassadors who came of their own volition, who established relationships with indigenous peoples, who left their genetic and cultural and artistic imprint on the foundational civilizations of the hemisphere. That is not a minor revision to the identity narrative. That is a transformation of it. It shifts the African relationship to the Americas from one that begins with chains to one that may begin with sails, from one that begins with captivity to one that may begin with discovery. The political stakes of the pre-Columbian African contact question for the communities most directly affected by the history of slavery are not simply academic. They are existential. They are about who you are and where you come from and what your ancestors were doing before the worst thing that ever happened to your people happened to your people. Why should you care about this if you are not African descended, if you are not American, if you are watching this from a place with no immediate stake in the Columbus narrative? Because the story of who discovers things shapes the story of who creates things, who builds things, who matters in the ongoing human project of civilizational development. When the history books tell you that civilization moved in one direction, from Europe outward to the rest of the world, and when that story turns out to be false, the implications are not confined to a footnote correction. They require a fundamental rethinking of what civilization is, where it comes from, and who has contributed to it. The Olmec heads carved in Mexico with African faces are not a curiosity. They are a question. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What did they know? What did they bring? What did they teach? What did they learn? The answers to those questions, if pursued honestly rather than deflected ideologically, open up a history of human interconnection and mutual cultural exchange across oceans that the standard narrative of isolated civilizational development has suppressed for 500 years. That history, the real history of human contact and exchange and influence across the world's oceans before Columbus is more interesting, more complex, more human, and more true than the story of a single European sailor stumbling onto a beach in 1492 and claiming to have discovered a place where millions of people were already living, and where, as we now know, African people had already arrived and carved their faces into stone and sailed home and sailed back and traded and exchanged and left their botanical fingerprints in the soil and their genetic fingerprints in the crops and their physical fingerprints in the monuments that still sit in Mexican museums, staring out at anyone willing to look honestly at them and ask the only question that has ever mattered: who was here first? Here is the answer, one final time, stated as plainly and as completely as the evidence allows. Did Africans discover America before Columbus? The evidence says yes, they almost certainly made contact. Whether that contact constitutes discovery in the full sense depends on how you define discovery. And the definition of discovery is itself a political question that has always been answered in favor of the people with the power to write the history books. Columbus discovered nothing he understood. He arrived in a place he could not identify, among people he called by the wrong name, in a world he had no framework to comprehend. The Malian emperor, who sent 2,000 boats west in 1311, knew he was looking for something. The boats that may have arrived knew they had found something. The faces carved into 40-ton stones in the Mexican jungle knew whose faces they were preserving. The crops that traveled from Africa to America in human hands knew what hands had carried them. The bottle gourds growing in pre-Columbian American soil knew they had not flown across the Atlantic on their own. The stone does not lie. The soil does not lie. The genetics do not lie. The journals of Columbus do not lie. The oral traditions of West Africa do not lie. The oral traditions of Indigenous Americans do not lie. The only thing that has been lying for 500 years is the story that was told to justify why only one kind of person gets to be called a discoverer, and why the evidence of every other kind of person's arrival gets filed under myth, legend, coincidence, or academic controversy requiring further study. The further study has been done. The evidence is in. And the verdict is that Africa was there first. Africa is always first. And the only reason you are hearing this for the first time tonight, instead of in a classroom 30 years ago, is that the classroom was built by the same people who built the story of Columbus. And both of them had the same thing to hide.